You are the sunshine of my life. Yeah, that's why I'll always be around. Ooh, ooh, yeah. You are the apple of my eye. I can't remember the rest of that verse. Anyway, how you guys doing today? Starting a new day. Start off with a little bit of a song. Here we go. I'm telling you about the dynamic growth of America in the antebellum period, of course, and we're focusing on the issues of population. One issue of population is indeed urbanization. Or the apple of my eye. Forever you'll be mine. Yeah, sounds on, thanks. I've been forgetting to turn the microphone on, and so Patty was there to remind me of doing that. Anyway, one of the phenomenon of population growth is indeed urbanization. So what I want to do is suggest to you what's happening in terms of urbanization in the antebellum period. One of the arcing narratives of the history of the United States of America is this dynamic of urbanization. The story of America is a real simple one of a country that was born in the country. In the colonial period, we're looking at probably less than 8% of the population being urban, grew up and moved to the city. Today, the population is probably in excess of 75% urban suburban. So clearly there's a dynamic here of going from the rural kind of existence to the urban existence. And we see that, it's a continuum kind of essentially, but we see it beginning to happen kind of in earnest as far as the antebellum period is concerned. In 1800, there were only 2 cities in the United States of America with a population in excess of 25,000. Those 2 cities would have been Philadelphia, I think it's around 38,000, and New York City in excess of 60,000. It's always so intriguing to think that the largest city in America in 1800 was New York, with simply 60,000. Escondido has 100 plus thousand people, much larger than New York City at that particular time. In the antebellum period, though, we see the cities beginning to grow and burgeon in a fairly significant way. So here's some numbers for you. By the time we get to 1860, there were over 22 cities with a population in excess of 40,000. There were 9 cities with a population in excess of 100,000. And there was 1 city with a population in excess of 1 million. And it's not exactly true, but I'm going to go ahead and use that. Of course, the largest city in America was New York. And at that time, New York was simply Manhattan Island. And Manhattan Island would have had a population of around 180,000 people. So that it's not a million, right? But right across the East River was Brooklyn. And Brooklyn was the 3rd largest city in the world, in America, not the world, third largest city in America, with I think 220,000 people. So the metropolitan area was indeed 1 million people. So we kind of, and plus you all know that Brooklyn will one day become part of New York City. So we see that there is a kind of dynamic development towards urbanization. Even by 1860, though, the urban population represented only 20% of the American population. So we still see that the nation as a whole is overwhelmingly rural, 80% of the people living in the countryside. But the cities are beginning to grow and develop at this time. Now, much of the urban development was in the older cities of America. And I don't have my map here, so I'll pull it over just a little bit for you guys. So that would mean, cities like Boston, like New York, and like Philadelphia, and Charleston even, were cities that were growing dramatically during this time. But the real exciting urban growth of the antebellum period were these new cities just kind of popping up out of nowhere, basically. Areas that had been wilderness in 1800 would become significant cities by the time we get to 1860. And we're talking about Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Cincinnati down here at the southwestern part of Ohio. St. Louis begins to kind of develop itself, essentially. One of the greatest stories of this area, though, was right here. This is the southwest corner of Lake Michigan. And if you went there in 1800, the most you're going to find are some Indian villages. If you return there in 1860, a city of like 120,000 people, it would become the city of broad shoulders, the city of the bears, the city of the bulls, the city of the Blackhawks. Hope that's enough hints to let you guys know. This is going to be Chicago. Chicago just burgeoned kind of out of nowhere to become the major city of the Midwestern part of the United States. So we do see cities appearing out of nowhere kind of. And one of the most exciting developments of a city, the last of the great antebellum cities essentially developed, occurred way out here. So it was a little place on this peninsula, and the Spanish had called it Yerba Buena because there were nice herbs there in the area near Mission Dolores. And it really was the Americans who come in and kind of transform it. They're going to create the name that will stick with it. It's intriguing that the city has a Spanish name, but it is the Americans that were going to apply that name to it in association with the bay where they live. In 1848, there were just about 800 people living in that little teeny village right there, kind of, you know. There was a creek that ran down from where the Mission Dolores was that would head out into the bay, and this is where most of the settlement was. Small rudimentary buildings and stuff like that. So 1848, 800 people. 1849, about 30,000 people. 1 year later, 50,000. And that doesn't really even include all the transient population that will go through this. It will make it the most dramatic growth of an American city in the history of the United States. Just this extraordinary explosion, you know, from being really just a village to becoming a fairly important city. That city, of course, was grounded in its growth in its relationship to the gold rush, of course. And I'm guessing you guys know what I'm talking about. San Francisco was, you know, the last of the developing antebellum cities. America's first major city to the west of the Mississippi River. America's first major city, of course, on the Pacific Ocean. You know, it really was the cultural, economic, political hub of California for quite a long time. Los Angeles will, you know, take some time to fully develop itself. That's much more of a 20th century development. But, you know, in the antebellum period, we see cities really beginning just kind of explode out of nowhere, basically. A couple last things about cities. The cities were primarily a northern phenomenon. So if we go to the south, there's not a lot of urbanization. The two major cities of the south were Charleston in South Carolina. Charleston was basically the Ellis Island of slavery. I hope you get the illusion. And so that's where much of the slave came in. Even at that time, though, it's beginning to kind of disconnect, you know. Most of the action is in the hinterlands. But Charleston was important, and clearly the political hub and a political hub of the entire South in some way. The most important city of the South, though, was down here on where the Mississippi River is coming out at the port of New Orleans. And New Orleans just was an extraordinarily burgeoning city. It was the great metropolitan center of the South in many ways. It was the depot of slavery, so that meant, or excuse me, not slavery, cotton. So cotton is coming from a variety of different sources, ultimately down the Mississippi River. And, you know, one of my images of that era would be the steamboats coming down the river, just, you know, piled with the cotton bales. Cotton bales higher than the superstructure. The only thing taller than the cotton bales would be the smokestacks. And by the way, that actually was an indication of a potential danger. That sometimes, you know, there are wood burnings, steam boilers, and here comes, you know, ashes out of the cinders out of the smokestacks, landing on the bales themselves and igniting them upon occasion. And on more than one occasion, you had a fully engulfed steam, you know, one of the steamships going down the river. Of course, I'm just guessing everyone is just bailing out, right? And, you know, it would have been amazing just to watch this huge kind of thing, you know, in flames heading towards a crash. But New Orleans was critical. You know, this is where the cotton is coming in, of course, from much of the South and being exported out to various locations. So the South really only has two kind of, and both of their cities are on the periphery. If you go into the interior of the South, it is overwhelmingly rural. It's keeping the old model with in excess of 90% of the population living in the rural areas. But Jackson, Mississippi would have been just a village. Montgomery, Alabama, just a village. Even Atlanta was just a village, you know, really. So these are just small locations, as most of the significant urbanization is occurring in the north. It's basically a northern phenomenon. And my last little thing I want to tell you about urbanization, the cities are burgeoning, but as you can imagine, very difficult places to exist, essentially. It's hard to imagine New York City, you know, let's just go ahead with that, you know, number of 830,000 or so. Manhattan Island, and there's no sewers. There are zero sewers for the entire place. So, you know, got all these people just living there, of course, and the streets basically become the sewers as people would dump their night soil, you know, sometimes just throwing it out the window, basically. If I lived at that time, I think I would wear, you know, a hat that was huge, made out of canvas, so I could, you know, because they'd garde-lou, they'd throw the stuff outside the window. Anyway, you know, cities, you go back in time, cities must have just been awful places, of course. Edinburgh was called Aldriki, you know, it smelled so bad, and I read that you could smell Beijing from miles away as you approached it just because of the concentration of humanity and, of course, the inability to really deal with, you know, all of their excrement and urination and fun stuff like that. So cities were tough places to live, and they were places where life expectancy was shorter, where infant mortality rates were higher. You know, we don't really get too many good images, but if you've ever seen the movie The Gangs of New York, you know, this is from Antebellum, New York, and, you know, hyper-stated essentially, but it does give you a sense of kind of the squalor and the congestion, the pollution, and even the criminal behavior that you would have found in terms of these cities. So increasingly important, increasingly dynamic, but also difficult places for people to survive, you know, in the antebellum period. But urbanization is a kind of critical phenomenon of the antebellum period. And then, you know, in the aftermath of that, of course, the cities are going to grow even larger. I'm holding the remote for some ridiculous reason. Anyway, Another thing I just wanted to highlight in the antebellum period to kind of continue on some of the notions that I'd given you when we did the development of colonial America. The wealth distribution situation was similar in the sense that you still had a really robust middle class. That's always a good idea, right? Relatively fewer people down there were in poverty, more people here that are in the middle class. But one thing that's important in terms of the distribution is that, it began to stretch out in terms of the differences between wealth and poverty. There began to be more relatively wealthy people in America, and the distance between wealth and poverty became much more significant. The wealthiest man in America in 1820 was John Jacob Astor with a personal fortune of 20 million. Money is always relative, so we can't really, I can't tell you how rich he really was, and I will tell you later that that was based upon the fur trade industry. But you're beginning to see some pretty wealthy people in America, and a greater distinction between wealth and poverty, with the potential, of course, to create a greater level of animosity between the social elements. In the class occupational structure, I just want to add kind of the increased sophistication that was coming into play in what you see here. The primary additions would be the industrial working class. As the Industrial Revolution kicks off, especially in the Northeast, you're beginning to see more industrial workers, and the industrial bourgeoisie, also those people who own the factories. They're going to become increasingly important elements within the social structural apparatus. Of course, deference was dead now. It's more an egalitarian society as Americans began to both feel that they were equal, of course, and to assert that feeling of equality. One of the symbols of the growing sense of equality is based on the election of Andrew Jackson. All of the early presidents were members of the colonial elite. You've got Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and then John Quincy Adams was the son of a member, and he's the son of John Adams. But the next president was Andrew Jackson. And the critical factor was that Andrew Jackson was born in relative poverty. He came from a poor family in South Carolina. He was a child during the era of the Revolution, and he has this incredible kind of moment there where he and his brothers are like smarting off to some British officer, and the British officer on horseback takes his sword and he slaps Andrew Jackson in the face. He didn't slice it, but the flat side of the sword, you can still imagine, what the flat side of a sword will do to your face, and it did cut into him, and it did scar him for life. And as you can imagine, Andrew Jackson would retain an enmity towards the British for his entire life. But when he was elected president, by that time, he was a rich man. I mean, that's the thing I always think so interesting. So he came from relative poverty, but by the time he's a president, he's a wealthy man. But he had come from the people. He was a man of the people. And to demonstrate that, he was the one and only president to hold an open house in the aftermath of the inauguration. So at the White House, food and booze and out there on the lawn, and people could come inside the house. And it's the only time they'll ever do this because they realized it was, untenable. It was a disaster. People went into the White House, they're tearing stuff up, they're I don't know, messing around one way or the other. And it, fairly clear, it became clear to Jackson himself, we can't do this. We can't let the people just kind of run unimpeded through the White House. But the election of Andrew Jackson is a symbol of an increased sense of general equality, the deferential components of whatever had been there in colonial America. These things are, of course, really no longer coming into play. Okay, so I'm going to end this portion on population with this kind of interesting perspective on America at that moment. The Americans were kind of just too busy in terms of what they were doing to really take any accounting of themselves. It always makes me feel kind of like, the years of my life, or the days of my life. I've always thought it was cool when people kept journals, and if you keep journals, I think that's a cool thing to do. But part of me, if I thought about keeping a journal, part of me was like, I'm not doing anything that really interesting, that I would want to write down for people. Though I might have interesting thoughts, But a bigger part of it was I just felt too busy, in the most intense moments of my life. For instance, when my kids were growing up and all, I was too busy to do any of that kind of stuff. I'm trying to develop my career. I'm trying to create my classes. I'm doing all that kind of stuff. So, I was just, I'm not going to take an accounting of my life at that particular time. Now I'm in a position where maybe I will take something more of an accounting of my life. But the Americans were just too busy to really account for what was happening to them. So, intriguingly, we have to leave it to a foreigner to tell the story of what's happening in America at that time. And the individual who will do this was a Frenchman by the name of Alexis de Tocqueville. And Alexis de Tocqueville becomes a potential identification for us. I want to tell you something about him. De Tocqueville was from France, and when you're day anything kind of in France, that's like an indication that you came from the aristocracy. In Germany, it would be von. In Holland, it would be van. In France, it's day. So he was Alexis of this place called Tocqueville, which was the seat of his family, his aristocratic family. as an indication of his aristocratic pedigree, he had had some relatives who had their heads chopped off in the French Revolution. And by the time you get to Alexis de Tocqueville, there's no recognition of the aristocracy whatsoever. And indeed, de Tocqueville was basically, I mean, he's an intellectual and clearly had some privilege, but he was working for the French government, so he's not manifesting that kind of level of aristocracy. Well, de Tocqueville was given a commission from the French government to come to America to study the American penitentiaries. The American penitentiaries were this new experiment the Americans were conducting, which I hope I can tell you about more, that will confront the issues of crime and punishment. And so, they were doing something interesting and somewhat remarkable. Gus is trying to get me it. Anyway, so they sent de Tocqueville over there to kind of study it. So that was his job. He's supposed to come over to America, go to the penitentiaries, see what's going on there, and then report ultimately to the French government. Now, I don't know why he thought he could do this, but he gets to America with a French government expense account, and he decides to kind of go wild, So he simply decided that it became his objective to travel all across the United States. So we will travel over the next 8 months. He's there for about 8 months. He's going to travel all over the United States, traveling some 4,000 miles. And I am impressed by this, primarily because there's not a whole lot of, there's only one mechanized form of transportation at that time, and that would have been a steamship. So the rest of it is him walking on carriages and wagons, riding horses, of course, in canoes, floating down the river on a raft, the variety of things that you could do at that time. But he does actually travel throughout America. And at that time, he actually went to every single so America would have been just this area kind of right here. So every existing territory and state, including getting all the way out to Minnesota. Apparently, he had a traveling companion by the name of Gustav. Get down! You're messing with my stuff. Ugh. My cat's giving me difficulty. Anyway, he had a guy by the name of Gustav who traveled together, and the two of them even got a little bit lost in Minnesota there. But down the Mississippi River, across the southern tier, through the mid-Atlantic states to New England, all of these areas, traveling those incredible 4,000 miles. And as he did so, he was interested in talking to everyone and observing everything and interviewing and taking copious notes. He's like going to the Graduate School of America to study America, and then gathering all this information together. Well, he goes back to France, and he indeed did his report. He does the report on the first cat is messing with my stuff. Anyway, he does his report on the penitentiary, but he's also, of course, doing all this thinking and ultimately writing about what was going on in America. So what happened was that in 1835, he's going to publish a book called Democracy in America. And I don't know if I said it, but he came to America in 1831. It was on that one card. He writes a book called Democracy in America. And I have to tell you that when he writes this book, he's writing, one of the first significant analysis of the United States of America. No one had ever done anything quite like this. Okay, so we're leaving it to a Frenchman to do that. Now, a couple things that I just want you to know, because when you write a book, of course, you're writing for a particular audience. So I want you to know that Democracy in America was written by de Tocqueville in French for the French. He was not writing this for an American audience at all. What we think he was doing was, what we know he was doing really, was that the French were struggling so much kind of with, their governing apparatus. Since the French Revolution, there had been a tremendous amount of turmoil. There were republics, of course, but there were all restoration monarchies, dictatorship. The situation as far as France was concerned was sort of continually confusing. And what it seems like is de Tocqueville was trying to understand what the Americans were doing. And so he's presenting it to the French. So we're struggling a little bit. Here's what the Americans are doing. Let's look at what they do. What are the good things they're doing? What are the bad things they're doing? That's kind of what he's doing. Okay, so there's no intent on the part of de Tocqueville to kind of really express what's going on for Americans. He's writing this in French for the French. Now, I have to tell you that I don't know how this is going to happen. But probably it's more mundane than I want it to be. The publishers just realized that this would be a good thing to try to sell in America, and they translate it into English, and it's brought over to the United States, probably something like that. My more romantic view is I want it to be that there was an American in Paris walking down the street one day, and he sees in a bookstore window a book called Democracy in America, and he, of course, could read French, and he reads the book, and holy smoke, this is about the United States. And then he's going to take or he or she's going to take it back to America, and it's going to become, some part of the American situation. But it ultimately will be published in the United States of America in English, of course. And the Americans are just kind of thrilled by this, and it becomes just, it continues to be published in the United States. And I bet that if you go to any reputable bookstore, you're going to find Democracy in America. Now, it's not always really a positive analysis of what's going on in America. It can be critical in points, but I have to tell you, if someone wrote the book on Chris Johnson, it was highly critical, I would still say, I don't care. It's a book about me. I mean, it's exciting to think that someone would write something about the Americans. Now, this is a long tome. It's about 800 pages long. At least that was the copy I had in graduate school when I had to read it. And it says a lot of things. So, I'm just going to suggest a few. Any book that's important, of course, it's always important because it says something that's important. So, I want to tell you some of the things that de Tocqueville had to say about America. Now, one of the things he's trying to do is just understand how it works in America. Now, this one point that is always just this. For me, it's important. The book is Democracy in America, and yet I just told you a little while ago, of course, in creating the Constitution, creating a republic, that we're not a democracy, and that's true. So whenever anyone says democracy in America nowadays, what we're really talking about is just the level of participation on the part of the people. It's not, we are a Republican form of government, but how much are we participating, or how are we participating? How are the people involved? That's kind of what's going on whenever you say democracy. So the more democratic we are, the more involved we are, the less democratic we are, or things are, the less involved we are. So understand, it's not about the word democracy. It's just how are the people behaving, acting within the republic. That's what we're really talking about. So one thing that was fascinating to de Tocqueville was to try to understand, how does a large republic work? And of course, all he could see was that there are all these individual people, and each individual person, and of course, they would have been white men at that time, have a vote. But so you've got a vote and I've got a vote. But how does that? What happens with that vote? How do you make anything happen? If you're the individual American and you are convinced something important needs to happen, some change has to take place. How do you make it happen? And all by yourself, of course. De Tocqueville saw, and you and I would think the same thing. You seem relatively helpless. So what de Tocqueville realized, as he studied America, was that the Americans functioned through what he called the politics of association. The politics of association. So what that means is that we kind of know we can't do it by ourselves, right? It's too darn hard. So what we do is we find like-minded people, and we get together with them. And with them, maybe we can make something happen. And I want you to know, this is absolutely the way it works. Whatever your cause is, you can find a group. So if you're a skateboarder, there is a political group for you. If you're a mountain biker, there's a group for you. If you're an environmentalist, there's a group for you. If you're an anti-abortionist, there's a group for you. If you're pro-choice, there's a group. I mean, these kind of things, right? If you believe in guns and you think guns are the most important thing, and you want everybody to have a gun, and you want everyone to have an assault rifle so that they can just shoot up each other all the time and have a great time, then there's a group for you too. Maybe I went too far on that one. Sorry about that. Everybody has a group, basically. Just the way it works essentially in America. And so what we do is we gather with others who have the same perspective, who have the same agenda, and we try to work it out that way. That's where you gather power in this representative democracy, by getting a group and then making that group making that group effective, and making something happen with that group. And of course, that part of his understanding was that America was based upon two very substantial political associations that are, of course, called the political parties, the Democrats and ultimately the Republicans, although there were no Republicans at the time of de Tocqueville. So one thing that he looked at was, how do they function? Well, they all get together, in these groups, and they try to make they try to get their program going if they possibly can. Another thing that he noted, and I'm sure that he is not the inventor of this concept, but he was like the first to really perceive the functioning of the situation. And so he talked about what we could call the tyranny of the majority, the tyranny of the majority. Now this is based upon a very interesting question. So he looked at America and he saw that they were representative democracy, and he saw that the majority ruled, of course. And so the question is, does that mean the majority is always right? Does that mean the majority is always good? And I don't know how you guys feel about this, but I would have to say, I don't think the majority always is right, and I don't think the majority always is good. If you look at the majorities of America, you've seen that there have been so many potential abuses. The treatment of Native Americans, the treatment of the slaves, the treatment of African Americans, the treatment of women. How many people have suffered under because of the activities of the majority? So we can't say that it is good, and we also can't say that it's right. The majority is simply a majority. 51% of the people are saying, have some perspective on the whole thing. And Of course, it is subjective to some degree, but even objectively, you could say, what they decide upon may not be good, in the long run. It may not be good in the short run, essentially. So he simply saw that, just because it's a majority doesn't mean it's always right or it's always good. And the other thing was that he saw the power of the majority. I mean, when 51% of the Americans say,